Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to reintroduce you tonight to a really fascinating gentleman. Dominic Cardy is his name. He is the member of the Legislative Assembly in New Brunswick for Fredericton West Hanwell. I think that's the correct pronunciation of the name. I'm not positive. He's gone through a tumultuous couple of months. He's most recently quit his job. He was in the Ukraine, and he's one of the speakers at a big conference coming up that's trying to reposition Canadian politics. So I think we got a lot to talk about. Dominic Cardy, welcome to the show, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me back on. I appreciate it.
So well, we appreciate it. So tell us a little bit about what's been going on the last couple of months with you. It seems like every day or week I plug in and there's some new news about Dominic Cardy.
I'm just trying to do my best to bump up New Brunswick's profile. You know, we don't get enough attention paid to us. It's been an interesting couple of months. I mean, I think the whole world's going through a pretty crazy period, and it's just I'm in politics, and so playing a little part in that. Starting off with in September, was able to make a trip to Ukraine just for a couple of days. Ended up being curtailed because I had to go to represent Canada at the UN, which was an honor, an interesting experience, especially coming from a war zone, but seeing the contrast between people on the ground fighting to defend their lives and their homes and their country, and then going to a place which is kind of famous for lots and lots of talking and not a lot of action.
Yeah,
that was difficult to stay quiet at some points during that experience, but Ukraine was incredible. I mean, the stuff that we've seen on the news with Ukrainians' incredible resilience and willingness to push back against this just evil force that's pushing into that country was really inspiring. Clearly, there's a lot more we can do. One thing I think it's really important anytime I'm getting a chance to talk to folks in Canada, that, you know, I'd gone there and absolutely appreciated the support that Canada had offered to the Ukrainian government, but thought that we could do a lot more. But on the ground in Ukraine, people view us the same as the US and the UK, which was kind of nice to hear, that we're seen as a serious player, a serious ally, and a country that's going to stand by Ukraine through thick and thin. So that was gratifying to hear, knowing
Why did you go? Where did you go? Why did you go?
I went to try and create some connections between the education system in New Brunswick and more broadly in Canada and Ukrainian education, and looking to see if there were ways in which as well that smaller communities could do something more direct and useful to help Ukraine. I mean, one of the problems that you always have now with major humanitarian disasters like the war in Ukraine with millions of people displaced, one of the biggest peacetime movements or wartime movements ever recorded, is that you get a huge amount of public support, which is still going on for Ukraine, which is great, but it ends up with lots of material that often isn't necessarily what's most needed, being sent by well-meaning groups that then languishes in warehouses or takes up the logistics capacity of folks who otherwise could be helping to get weapons to the front line or goods that are really needed. And part of the problem is that, you know, we've got this long-standing history of having relationships government to government, which of course we should, but that involves a whole lot of bureaucracy and really kind of ignores the changes in technology over the last couple of dozen years, where now we can go online and order, you know, whatever strange thing we might want from whatever corner of the world we could think of, and have it delivered to our house in a couple of days, all through the internet. So the thought was, why can't we do something similar where we would have Ukrainian communities able to identify their needs, not long-term, not for reconstruction, not the big projects, but things that will help them get through this stage of the war, create connections with Canadian communities where they could then see that, okay, in this town, say one of the towns that I visited was Bucha, where all the Russian atrocities took place back in the spring. Which,
oh my gosh, that must have been horrific.
It was. Yeah, I'll come back to that in a sec. It's just dealing with talking with folks there and seeing the horrors that had been meted out by the Russians. Also in Bucha, worth noting the reconstruction that's taken place, and lots of those places that we saw that were shelled out, the Ukrainians are just as good at rebuilding their own country as they are at taking down the Russians. And lots of places which had been just wrecked in February, March, April, now you couldn't even tell. Still some places where you can see total devastation, and talk about that in a bit. But the big thing, the idea would be that, let's say in Bucha, which to use a real example, they've had lots of their schools destroyed. There's been over 2,000 schools and kindergartens wrecked by the Russians. That was as of September. So the number has been going up by several.
Not in just Bucha, in Ukraine in total.
Country. More than half of the kids aren't in school this year, which is terrible. But anyway, so you would have the ability for communities to say, okay, we need for this kindergarten, we need 50 iPads. because we have to run the schools virtually because they're not allowed now to operate schools unless they can offer the kids air raid shelters, which is a tragedy, but makes total sense. So little things like that, where if I can create a connection with a community here in New Brunswick or anywhere else in Canada, it just seems like a way that we can break down some of the bureaucracy that often slows down getting the aid that people really need. The international community has done as good a job as they can in getting that emergency relief, tents for people who are homeless, helping with those sort of really, really urgent high-level demands. But the things that help make life bearable through a war, those little things are areas where we could make a difference, and we can do it easily and without bureaucracy. So we're working to partner with folks who are going to be flying planes over to Ukraine to bring back refugees, to bring back other materials, seeing if we can get shipments in there, and seeing if we can use the power of the Canadian education system, because I think this is a great civics opportunity, so that kids can help in their communities to identify needs in a community in Ukraine and then help fill them. Because we had so many people in the school system in New Brunswick who were asking in February and March, what can we do to help? How can we stand for Ukraine? And what can we do that's going to be useful? This is a way to answer that question in a really concrete form. And I have to give thanks to Minister Sajan, our International Development Minister in Ottawa, and Ambassador Ray at the United Nations, who when I went there and met with both of them, were very supportive of this. And because Canada doesn't have a federal education system, so there's no Canadian Minister of Education, which is kind of unusual, that this would be a way in which a part of the system that's often kept out of international support, the Canadian school system and all the provinces and territories, that they might be able to play a role. So even though I'm no longer education minister, I'm still pushing ahead with this idea because I think it's one that's going to help meet some needs. And it's low cost, low bureaucracy, just a way of identifying needs, getting them filled, and then helping people get through the horrifying experience that we can all see they're having to go through in Ukraine right now.
Well, it sounds like it was a very impactful trip, and obviously a great effort that you were involved in. Thank you for that. So why did you then end up going to the United Nations, provincial politician?
Well, because there's no federal minister of education. There was a World Education Summit preceding the General Assembly this year, the couple of days before. So they had education ministers from around the world. And then in Canada, the Council of Ministers of Education for the country, which involves the ministers from each of the provinces and territories. So there's a chair for that, who is the minister from Saskatchewan right now, Minister Bryant. He couldn't make it, and so they asked me to go. So it was, given my background working in that sort of the international world and diplomacy and so on, it was an okay fit for me. My only sadness from it was that because it was arranged at the last minute, that I had to cut short the trip to Ukraine and not visit some places that I'd wanted to. But as it was, my partner and I, who traveled with me, that she's had lots of experience in Ukraine, visited many times, and we built connections with different folks in different parts of the country. We've been hoping to go out towards Kharkiv over in the east, but that was also the point when the offensive against the Russians in that part of the country was taking place. So in the end, probably a good thing not to be in the way there. The last thing they need is foreign civilians wandering around while they're trying to get on with the business of pushing the Russians out.
Well, it sounds like it was a pretty interesting trip, and I want to ask you about a little bit about what happened in the United Nations. But we're going to take a break for some messages. Our guest tonight is Dominic Cardy. We're going to be chatting about why he quit his job, what he thought about the election of a new leader of the Conservative Party federally, because he's been positioning himself in an organization called Centrist Canadians in the center of the political spectrum. And talk a little bit about what else is going on with his life, because it seems like lots is going on. We're going to take a break, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Stay with us.
You could just say.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest today is Dominic Cardy. He is the former Minister of Education in New Brunswick. He is the current member of the Legislative Assembly from Fredericton, West Hanlon. He is a principal, a member of the board for an organization called Center Ice Canadians, which used to be Center Ice Conservatives. It's now Center Ice Canadians. They've got a conference coming up this week in Atlantic Canada, where he's going to be speaking on Atlantic Canada issues. He's someone that really positions himself in the center of the political spectrum. He's recently quit his job. And so I think that we're going to have an interesting conversation about what's going on in politics. Let's turn to that, sir, if we could. Why'd you quit your job?
I'd had some frustrations for some time with the premier, which is not any surprise for anyone involved in politics. It's always a business of compromise. You get access to to the ability to make decisions. And in exchange for that, you have to work with other people who are also trying to get what they need to get done as well. So that's normal. In the spring of this year, the party here, I shouldn't really say the party because the party wasn't involved. The Premier invited into our caucus the two members of the former People's Alliance of New Brunswick, which was a small populist party that had spoken out for many years against the dual system we have in New Brunswick, where Canada's only officially bilingual province, basically pushing back against rights for francophones. And that was done without any consultation with the party, which I found difficult, but they weren't in cabinet. So that was one of those ones where you might not like it, but you suck it up. In the summer, we had the Premier in the face of the healthcare crisis that's sweeping the country. And I completely understand the need to act. And I hope we might get a chance to talk about that, because I think we need to act much more radically than anyone's been proposing so far to fix that system. But in an attempt to try and break the logjam of bureaucracy that was, in his mind, impeding reforms, there was a decision to replace the health minister and also to abolish the elected health boards, which are popularly elected positions, and to do that without any consultation with cabinet. And you could say, okay, New Brunswick's a little province in a wealthy country. It's all very sleepy and quiet. Who really cares? Not many people even voted for these popularly elected groups. That was one of the problems with them. But there were some good people on them. But the point for me wasn't the quality of the work that was being done. It was that lack of consultation. The difference between our system, where you have a tiny cabinet compared to the population of whatever jurisdiction you're talking about, 12, 15 people, usually maybe 20 if you're up at the federal level. You get, as Premier, Prime Minister, you get to appoint those people. And the whole point is that they're there at your pleasure. But the reason they're there, and the reason why the standards are so low, basically, for premiers and prime ministers in terms of that selection, they can literally pick whoever they want, is that you're supposed to have a little bit of a check and balance, that you're supposed to have at least a group of people who you obviously like enough to have given them these jobs, or think they're useful enough to have given those jobs, that you at least consult with them. That's the basis of our system. We don't call our system a prime ministerial system. We call it a cabinet system of government. If you don't use the cabinet, you don't have a cabinet system of government. And in this particular case, there was, again, no consultation over abolishing elected officials, about not just removing them from their posts, but abolishing the positions, whether temporary or not. And that, in my mind, required a lot of consultation and discussion. And have real issues with that, because we see around the world right now people making decisions in established democracies to undermine democratic institutions, not because of any ill will. And I don't think the Premier here was doing this because he was trying to subvert democracy. He was just seeing that I just need to get things done. I just need to get moving. And the problem with that is exactly the path that, once you start to legitimize it as a democratic politician, legitimizes the anti-democratic politicians. And we're seeing that everywhere right now, as more and more leaders try and justify bad behavior by saying, we're acting for the people, we're trying to get things done, we're trying to make the trains run on time. That's a slippery slope, and we cannot start to go down that road, and we need to draw attention to it. So that was also something that I was like, okay, this is getting really problematic.
So are you suggesting that the Premier of New Brunswick was on his way to authoritarianism?
I think any governments around the world right now are sliding down this road because people aren't using the system the way it's supposed to be used. Again, we have a cabinet system of government. If you have a cabinet system of government and the cabinet isn't consulted, clearly there's a problem, especially in something as major as this. Premiers absolutely have the right to make all kinds of decisions unilaterally, and that's totally normal. But abolishing a body of elected officials without any consultation, that's a dangerous precedent. So it's, again, I think something we need to start talking about.
What was the response, both from the Premier as well as, the public when you made this announcement?
Well, ultimately, I resigned over the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. Was a meeting now about 3 weeks ago with the Premier and a number of officials from my department around education reforms. And we've been trying to overhaul our French immersion system in the province that's become very much a streaming system where we have kids from well-off backgrounds, usually in urban areas, who access French immersion, which gives them access to generally a really good level of education, but gives them an advantage over the kids who don't have access to that system, which is around 40% of the children in the Anglophone system in New Brunswick. And it's hard in a province where having a reasonable command of French is very important for getting jobs in the public service, in the service sector. Lots of different opportunities are restricted if you're not bilingual. So there was an effort to roll out some reforms, which were already underway and were working well. But the premier was trying to impose a political timeline on those reforms over the advice of the department and all of the experts who we consulted and other people who he chatted with in his political circle who were teachers, former teachers in some cases. So there was a real effort to politicize this and saying, no, I don't care what the evidence says, we're just going to do this next year. And that was the point when I said, okay, this is just not tenable. We cannot have a government that claims publicly to be based on evidence before politics. The premier's favorite slogan is province before politics, when we end up by making a decision that is purely politically driven, driven by nothing at all except for the imperatives of the election cycle. And so that was the point when he then also presented with the evidence around this, responded to my deputy minister and the Anglophone sector saying, who gave him all this data and said, "Beta my ass," which has become sort of a tagline. But to me, that was sort of the end of the project for me politically, working with the premier, that I'm not interested in working with someone who dismisses data, that you can't claim to be evidence driven if you pick and choose the evidence that you like. Because that again leads to that slippery slope where we just come out of COVID with all these discussions around evidence, science, and everything else. If people can't trust their politicians to have a coherent, consistent stand towards evidence and facts, then we can't be surprised that populists and extremists on the left and the right start to gain traction. So at that point, I resigned. The premier was extremely unhappy, announced that he was going to kick me out of caucus, held a Zoom meeting on that the next morning, I believe it was. And now I'm sitting as an independent, which is just fine.
So you're no longer a Conservative member?
I'm still a member, which has been nice that I've had a huge outpouring of support from people in the party and around the province. I was kind of dreading this because I thought that it was going to be a barrage, getting a barrage of hate mail and people being hostile, but very, very few people being critical and hundreds of very positive messages. And also became very clear that I am still a member of the Progressive Conservative Party, which is a party that I campaign for. I'm elected on the basis of the platform that we campaigned on in 2020. And I'm going to continue to vote for the things that were in that platform and continue to be a member in good standing of the party until told otherwise, which there doesn't appear to be any drive to expel me from the party. So this is, again, another point I made in the letter, an example of centralizing control in the premier's office. Premier shouldn't be deciding who sits in caucus. That's a job for the caucus chair, and the premier shouldn't be putting their hands on the scale. I know it happens, but again, if we don't push back against this stuff, and people in my position don't push back against it, who is going to? If we don't start to have people who are elected who are willing to give up the perks of office to say this has to stop, we have got to reinforce our democratic standards, who else is going to do it?
Do you sound like Canada's Liz Cheney?
She's got better hair. But
I'm serious. Are you Canada's Liz Cheney?
Well, no, because I think there's a lot of people in Canada who think like me, and a lot of people in the progressive conservative and conservative movement across Canada who think like me. And the problem we have is in Canada, I think we're often a little bit more deferential than our American cousins. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to have to change, because the folks who are pushing to undermine our system, they're not deferential at all. They're copying the Trump playbook and other populist playbooks. And so I think we're not at the stage yet where I'm certainly in no way comparing the premier of New Brunswick to Donald Trump in any way. I don't think that the decisions he's made that I've just gone through, I don't think he's doing them with any level of intentional malice. I think he genuinely believes that he's doing the right thing for the province. The problem we have is a structure where premiers can get into a position where they would make some of the decisions that I've described and not recognize how dangerous they are. And that speaks to the broader weakness in our democratic institutions. So I don't think we're at the stage yet where it's going to be the last stand of a tiny number of moderates against a populist monolith, but we're going to head in that direction if we don't start behaving better as politicians in this country. So I think it's much more, I think right now, Canadian politicians who are tolerating populists and sliding towards less democratic structures inside their governments. I think it's much more like the Republican Party that first opened the door to the Tea Party back 20 years or so ago now, and who started to embrace that way of doing politics. And rather than saying, absolutely not, this is not what our system is about, this is not democratic, rather than saying that, there's this attempt to accommodate and to bring in and to soothe and to calm and maybe hopefully get those folks to vote for you. That is where we are right now, I think. But Canada's usually a couple of years behind some other places in our political development. So we should at least take advantage of that state of being a little bit behind and look what's happening elsewhere and see if we can avoid some of the horrors that are currently, ripping the UK apart, which has gone from being a serious power in the world to being kind of a laughing stock, which is kind of embarrassing for me as someone born in that country. The States, we all spend a lot of time talking about what's happening there. Italy just elected a neo-fascist as prime minister. We're seeing this wave of extremism on the left and the right around the world. And Canada's got a limited amount of time to be able to push back against that. And part of the way we do that, I think, is by we have to have more politicians, regardless of what policies they'd like to implement, agree on a common set of rules and standards and behaviors and start to live that life and act based on those principles, whether they're in office, in opposition. If we don't, we're screwed.
Okay, Dominic, let me be frank with you here. You say that some people, are accommodating populist efforts and populist type of policies to attract them, to encourage them, to listen to them, to potentially get them to vote for you. I had lunch with one of the organizers of the truck convoy, a couple of weeks ago, and they told me that the Conservative Party leadership was a takeover of the Conservative Party by the truckers convoy. And I don't know whether anything she said is right, but it sounds kind of interesting. She said that 80% of the new people that joined the Conservative Party to vote in the leadership were males between the ages of 20 and 45. They were all white, and they were all with emails that came from the trucker convoy, and they were all anti-vaxxers and very influenced that way. And she said, "Look, we've taken over the Conservative Party, and we elected the person as leader that we wanted."
Yeah, I mean, that's the only thing that I would differ from what you just said, that I've heard the figure was 75%, but that's a pretty minor quibble. That is what we're facing right now. And until Canadians in the center, which is nearly all of us, stop pussyfooting around and start to notice what is going on, that we have people who are trying to take over our institutions who, first off, have no understanding of how they work. And that's kind of an unpopular thing to say. And to phrase it that way is even more unpopular in an age where we're supposed to pretend that everyone is equally capable of doing everything. That accepting of this crass populism, where we would say that someone who has spent no time at all working on a subject is equally capable of managing a multi-billion-dollar file as someone who spent their life in it in the civil service, is deranged. We have power plants in our country, pieces of infrastructure that are more complicated than the entire country would have been to run 100 or so years ago. So just at the point when everything is getting vastly more complex and great. I mean, we're talking here about trying to defend a system that is given standards of living, equality, and wealth that are unlike anything ever seen in the history of this planet. So all these losers going on about freedom and about how somehow or other that some of the restrictions around COVID were somehow the end of the universe. They have no idea what actual oppression is like, what actual freedom.
Hold it. The new Premier of Alberta said that they were the most prejudiced, discriminated against group in Canadian history.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's. I think Danielle speaks for herself and demonstrates her principles every day.
Speak for herself. She's the new Premier of Alberta, and she got elected by a majority of Albertans in the Conservative Party, or United Alternative, or whatever it's called.
Majority in the United Conservative in the party, sure. We've also seen that Liz Truss was overwhelmingly elected as Prime Minister of the UK by members of the Conservative Party. If we keep on saying that this system, this way of picking leaders and this way of running governments works, we're going to end up with people who have absolutely no idea what they are doing, or worse, actively want to destroy the system that we have, running our provinces, running our country, and then it's going to fall apart. This democratic politics is not some sort of grade 1 class here. This is an incredibly complicated world that people are trying to manage. We have a system that has worked better than any other in trying to help manage that with multi-party democracy. And we're busy turning it into a system where populist movements are allowed to hijack parties and governments. And that's only happening because the people in those parties and in those governments are letting it happen. And I'm not saying that we should say, we shouldn't allow public participation. I'm saying we need to have politicians who are willing to stand up and say, this is actually incredibly complicated. I don't have a soundbite level solution for you. I do have 400 different things that if you're interested in talking about them, you can. But if you're not willing to do that work, there's a reason why I am not able to walk onto a building site and start telling people how to build a building. I don't have the qualifications or the skills to do that. And until we get back to having some recognition that this world that we built that gives us the spare time away from the drudgery and work that used to define everyone's lives pretty much all the time, except for a tiny number of rich people, till we recognize that that world is gone. Now we have that spare time because of this incredible system. But that incredible system depends on people with expertise in thousands and thousands of different fields being able to work in a stable environment where they can actually get that work done. That applies as much to people running building sites, power plants, running a healthcare system, running an education system. And this facile idea that we can just reduce it down to a chant of freedom, again, is the most single biggest distortion of that word that I can think of in recent history. And I think your point about what Danielle Smith said about the anti-vaxxers, I think proves my point in spades. The idea that people going through restrictions during a pandemic, regardless of the errors that were made, 2 years after that pandemic started, we're now sitting having public analysis, commissions on it, as we should, to find out who did what right, who did what wrong, hold people accountable if they did things wrong. That's how our system works, and it is working. That's the stuff that we have to hold on to. But when we have Democratic politicians who spend their entire time talking about how everything is terrible and our country is terrible, and on the left, they spend their time talking about how the past of our country is this shame-filled bloodbath where there's nothing to be proud of. And then on the right, they say that today is this horror show where we allow gays to have rights and whatever else. This is utter garbage. We have got to have a system which is based on the equality of individuals, their maximum freedom to live their lives as they wish. We cannot be legislating who people sleep with, their personal lives, all of those areas which we finally moved away from. And then have an evidence-based approach to managing public policy where we pick the areas of public life where it is worth the collective banding together to subsidize the healthcare system, the education system, things where we have now got 100 plus years of evidence that working together works better than having a private system. There's not many areas like that. We've got the evidence. Pick those areas. Government focuses on those, does the best they can in an accountable way, make sure they deliver results to the public. That's how we can build this. But if we reduce all this down to, again, to these chants on street corners, we're going to end up being like the places where politics is defined by street protests and riots. And those places are no fun at all to live. I've spent lots of my life working in and living in those spots. There are no Canadians who want to be in that situation. We don't want to be in a place where politics is driven by whoever can yell loudest on a street corner, whoever can inflame the mob the most effectively through social media.
But there are a lot of people that supported the truck convoy, and there's a lot of people within that potentially extreme organization or that extreme position in society that thought Danielle Smith was right and thought they were discriminated against. And there's a big rally downtown Toronto today to reaffirm that belief that their freedoms were infringed to a extreme degree, and that they were discriminated against.
Absolutely, and they are entirely within their rights to have those protests and to say those things and believe those things. There are lots of people who believe lots of things that are objectively not true. And one of the problems we have, and this is something where I'd switch my attention from the hard right to the hard left, is that the hard left has spent the last 30, 40 years undermining ideas of truth and reality through efforts to push postmodernism through the universities, which has then influenced generations of teachers and adults outside education as well. And so we've now lost any idea of what is right and wrong, what is real and not real. And so we've ended up with this sort of performative pantomime politics where we have people enjoying the full freedom to go out and protest and say whatever insane things they want, which is entirely appropriate. And at the same time, to genuinely believe, like you said, that they have somehow been massively oppressed and discriminated against. And absolutely, people's rights were infringed on during the protest, as is called for in our Constitution, which accepts that there are sometimes limits on rights under exceptional circumstances. But the fact that 2 years later, we are sitting here with none of these folks going to jail unless they're breaking the law by breaking things, able to protest, able to say these things. Also, those measures at an end. What sort of tyranny is that, where after less than 30 months, there's no trace of the measures that are supposed to have been this permanent and massive infringement on people's lives and rights? We have got to regain a sense of proportion. And too many of these movements, you are quite right that people feel that way. But lots of toddlers believe they are being grievously oppressed as well when they're told to do things they don't like to do. And we are sliding into a toddler politics where everyone thinks they should get what they want when they want it, and otherwise it's fascism. They want to see fascism. They should look across the ocean and see what's going on with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Russia's treatment of its own people. That is fascism. Public health restrictions are things we can argue about and fight about. But when we start to devalue the words that are being bandied around, like fascism, like authoritarianism, like freedom, in the way that the anti-vax and other protesters have, that's all they are doing is undermining the institutions that, again, if we screw around with them, these are things that took hundreds of years to evolve, and they've only evolved in a few places on Earth. And if we want to go back to street politics, having that determine how our country is run, we'll end up with the results that are the inevitable consequence of those decisions, which are poverty, exclusion, lack of freedom in a meaningful sense, not just not being able to express yourself politically, but having no money, no time, no ability to be able to participate in anything other than the drudgery of trying to put enough food on your table to be able to feed your kids. Because that's what a normal life is like for a huge number of people on this planet, even today. And we are so blessed in this country. And I'm so tired of people running our country down, saying that we're oppressive and totalitarian or evil or have this history bathed in blood. We have got lots of sins in our country that we absolutely have to try and do our best to make up for. But we do that by constantly moving forward and by being proud of where we are and where we've come from and where we're going to go. And I don't hear anyone in these movements talking about that. For them, it's all negative. It's all about ripping the country down, complaining about everything constantly, no practical solutions except just to yell freedom. Biggest devaluation of the word that I can think of.
Dominic Cardy, pretty hard-hitting comments on the state of politics in New Brunswick and in Canada today. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just a minute. And I'm going to ask Dominic if there's other people within either the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party that will stand up like him, because I don't think there are. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're having a really impassioned, interesting conversation today about the state of Canadian politics. I thought I was going to start talking about Atlantic Canada issues and what's going on with Dominic Cardy's political life because he quit the cabinet of New Brunswick recently, where he was the Minister of Education. He's still the minister. He's still the member of the Legislative Assembly for Fredericton West. What's the town again? Handwell. I apologize.
ELL.
Thank you, sir. I apologize. But he's sitting as an independent because the Premier arranged him to be kicked out of the caucus. And we've been talking about the state of Canadian politics and the freedom cry from too many people on the extremes. But Dominic, I got to ask you, honestly, I'm worried there are not a lot of people like you that are willing to give up their positions, that are willing to give up power, that are willing to stand up for principle. And maybe Liz Cheney is the example that I'd look to in the United States. I've talked to numerous different conservative friends that are involved in the Conservative Party. And while they may potentially agree with some of what you're saying, they see Pierre Poilievre as a chance to get power. And like I think a lot of Republicans that saw that Trump was a way to get power, I fear that they're going to give up on their principles and they're going to dismiss some of the comments that he's made that are, I think, ludicrous, like fire the governor of the Bank of Canada, that cryptocurrency and Bitcoin are the solutions to inflation, that all of inflation is Justin Trudeau's fault, on and on with some of the comments I could make, and his appeal to that very partisan populist group of convoy supporters by going out and actively supporting them, and frankly being comparable to Dr. Leslie Ann Lewis and him, who were competing during the leadership campaign about who was more supportive of the trucker convoy, which I thought was a little bit shocking when Jean Charest was saying, if you want to be prime minister and pass laws, you should frankly support laws and be in accordance with the laws of the land. But I fear that too many people want jobs, want to get in cabinet, want to have their party be successful, so much so that they're willing to give up on the principles that you've identified. And a lot of people that used to be progressive conservatives or red Tories that I can't imagine actually agree with his policies are doing so in the interest of power.
Yeah, I mean, humans are pack animals, right? And we have a strong tendency to band together and defer to leaders. It's something that's allowed us to evolve and become the dominant species on the planet, but it also, I think, held back our political development for a long time. That's why we've only the last couple of years had really anywhere in the world, and it's still imperfect and fragile, had countries where the general public, average citizens, the idea that even the average person would be a citizen, those ideas are pretty recent in the ways that they've taken hold. So we're constantly fighting against that tendency to look for the strong man, and it's nearly always a man, the strong man who's going to have all the answers and give you all the solutions, and you can just turn off the critical thinking parts of your brain, even though there's something in you that kind of, like you said, you kind of know that you're wrong, and you kind of know this might be dangerous, but there is a soothing calm that comes from surrender. And I think you're totally right that there are lots of people who are falling for that, just like they've fallen for every other bad authoritarian form of government throughout history, which again, until recently, was pretty much all of them. And we've seen those examples in the 20th century about how people thought they could make compromises with extremists and then only ended up being swallowed up, and in many cases imprisoned or killed by those same people just a few years later. And we need to start, I think, regaining a bit of a sense of historical perspective. I think one of the problems we have in Canada is that because we're so incredibly lucky, because we're such a great country, we've lived in peace. We've had no threats to our borders since 1812, really. We've lived in this state of isolation from world events, and then living with our big brother to the south of us, who took care of a lot of those difficult decisions and problems for us in terms of difficult choices around how do you contain communism during the 20th century, the fights over isolationism in the 30s. All of those things where we sort of outsourced those difficult problems. We can't do that anymore. The US is going into a period of serious political instability, and we can see Europe is already in the grip of that. And hopefully Ukraine will be able to prevail against Russia. If not, God knows what happens in terms of the message that would send to bad actors around the world about the weakness of democracy versus the power of authoritarianism. So I think there are people who are having the same conversations that we're having right now. I'm hoping that by speaking out as bluntly as I can in this, I can convince others who are in similar positions to mine to be able to join, again, a movement that I don't think has to be particularly partisan, because we have people who are willing to make those unacceptable compromises in all parties. But at some point, unless we can start to rally around some core set of democratic values again and to think about what those mean, because I think your last point about Charest and talking about if you're going to make laws, you should follow them. That's been a problem on the left and right in Canada for a long time. 10 years or so ago here in New Brunswick, we had protests against the development of shale gas. And we had a blockade that cut off access to a school and a health center and various other things organized by a First Nations community. And I've got lots of sympathy for the position of First Nations. And I think we need to come to realistic settlements with our First Nations that allow them to develop within the borders of the political entity known as Canada as quickly as possible. Tolerating the denial of access of all citizens to health services and schools and blocking public roads is breaking the law. I don't care what the reasons are why you're doing that. It's against the law. And if you're going to protest, and I'd say the same thing about the truckers, you need to accept that the consequence of civil disobedience is that you get arrested, not to complain about it. Martin Luther King didn't complain about getting arrested. He intended to get arrested. That's how you draw attention to injustice. But we had people on the left with those shale gas protests who were like, well, this is totally fine. We can't say anything against this. Just like you had people on the hard right saying with the trucker protests, the same thing. My argument, pox on both your houses. We have systems and structures in this country that allow you unparalleled access to the law, to political systems, with social media to communicate a political message to pretty much anyone you want to, whenever you want to. Following the law should be a base requirement. And anyone who doesn't advocate following the laws as they're currently written, I think is disqualifying themselves. So I totally agree with what Sheree said. Clearly, to your earlier point, you've got a conservative party that's filled with people who have no connection to the conservative movement, just like the people who took over the Republican Party to support Donald Trump had no connection to the Republican Party. At some point, we got to decide, are we going to put up with this, or are we actually going to come out of our comfy little worlds, take some times in the evenings and go to cold community centers and whatever else and participate, organize, and vote to make sure that our institutions are protected, our parties, because if we don't get our political parties secured or have political parties that are secure from this sort of populist foolishness, we're going to see the attacks, as you said, on the banking system, on our economy. And that way lies chaos. And we've seen that over and over again the last few years. And it's sadly most of human history. Why would we want to add to that? I don't know.
But Dominic, the Conservative Party federally has adapted to that. They're you've got a whole bunch of smart people within the Conservative Party that are blaming inflation on one individual and calling it just inflation. And they're completely supportive of the elected leader of the Conservative Party and are adopting all those policies.
Yep. And yeah, people have the free right in a democracy to choose to ignore reality. And that's totally fine. What I'm hoping is that Canada, as a country that is much bigger than the Conservative Party and the conservative movement, which has long roots in this country stretching back to Confederation and before, is much more than the temporary political allegiance that we see in Ottawa, supported by people who, again, have no particular connection to politics prior to the election of Poilievre, that we'll see them start to say, no, I'm going to put my time into pushing back against this. That the response to populism is engaged democracy. And that's going to require Canadians to bluntly get off their asses and put some work into keeping this country safe. Because otherwise, the pressures from left and right are going to grow and grow. And we're going to continue to have these idiotic arguments, like you said, about just inflation or about whether or not, how many genocides Canada committed 100 years ago, these sterile conversations that have nothing to do with making sure that First Nations Canadians, Francophone Canadians, Anglophone Canadians, all the new arrivals from around the world, that all of us have the ability to fix problems like how do we get our healthcare system working so that we don't have to deal with, to use an example from my constituency a couple of weeks ago, a woman who went to the emergency room 7 times for a cumulative total of 57 hours and never got to get care. That's the sort of problems that I think Canadians would actually like to see addressed. And we've got a political class that is just spiraling down the drain, falling into these traps of wasting our time talking about things like just inflation, obsessed with what's happening in the US and their domestic politics rather than looking at what's happening in Canada. So, but unless Canadians start to take their politics seriously and what's happening to this country, those guys are going to continue to do it because it works. It mobilizes the fringes, the extremes, the disaffected tiny minorities who like to go to political party events and scream and yell. Those folks are going to control our country unless we do something about it.
Okay, but what can we do about it? I hate to tell you, but as an independent, the likelihood of you getting elected is low. We had 3 pretty well thought of, were they all cabinet ministers? I can't remember, but that were forced out of the Liberal Party. They ran as independents and they all lost. I think that in our first past the system and our system where you've got to be, a member of a candidate for a major political party, getting elected with a different point of view is pretty damn challenging, isn't it?
It is. But first, there's more to politics than elected officials. And politics, and that's part of the problem, is that we've outsourced in too many cases running the country to a small group of people. And then we decided that we're not, the tiny percentage who are involved in politics, either as party members or obviously the tiny percentage who are actually elected folks. But hardly anyone's engaged in politics at any level because people find it frustrating, boring, hypocritical, all the fairly accurate criticisms you could level against our system. But it goes back to the Churchill line about democracy being the worst form of government except for all the others. And that definitely still holds true. And unless we can get people to participate either in established parties to hold back the populists, or engaged in either new political movements or parties to try and push back against the parties that have already been co-opted by these groups, it's a question of basic political mechanics. If the existing structures are weak, they will yield to the populists. And if the populists gain power, they will start to make it harder for people to organize. This is being seen around the world, again, hundreds of years. This isn't some sort of revelation here. We know what's going to happen. So we've got a few years now where we actually do have some actual freedom to be able to organize and mobilize around a positive message that I think has to be on a clear definition of what government should and shouldn't do, the rights of the individuals versus the state, and saying that there are rules. And to your point earlier, the foundation of those rules has to be the rule of law, and people who are elected upholding the law regardless of the consequences for them personally, and whether that's losing their job or gaining the ire of party activists.
Okay, and let's use this last leadership campaign in the Conservative Party as an example. I'm not a conservative. I'm no longer a member of the Liberal Party. I am in the center. I'm a fiscal conservative, a social progressive. I took a look at your leadership candidates, and Jean Charest impressed me. He had the executive experience as premier of a province. He was Captain Canada, and I went to that rally and was impressed with. I don't think we'd have Canada today if it wasn't for Jean Charest. I thought the policies that he was discussing were reasonable, and he got what, 13 or 16%? It was shockingly bad performance. It showed that the vast majority of the then members of the Conservative Party wanted something fairly dramatically different. With that kind of result, that's not a small group of people getting involved. That's a huge movement getting involved.
Well, a couple 100,000 people. So it's still, we're talking about across the entire country being less than the size of a medium-sized Canadian city. So yes, it's a problem, but it's not an insurmountable problem. And the reason why Poilievre won, I would argue, is because he did offer a clear, compelling message. He's a very smart guy, very organized, and was able to get that message out in a way that moderates and centrists haven't been able to for a long time, because moderates and centrists spend their time being defensive. We keep on talking about how it's basically always as though somehow the extremists are more pure, and we always think purity is better. So that somehow they're a more distilled version of what we believe in, and the more pure you are like that, somehow the better you're going to be in politics. That is never the actual case. Extremism is a great way to mobilize people for a leadership election. It's a terrible way to run a country, because how many successful places in the world, and I would use as a base for analyzing success, individual rights, wealth, freedom, all the things that generally we take, again, in Canada, take for granted. How many places like that are actually run by people who are clearly extremists? None, I would say. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. So you've got a disconnection right now in the center of politics, where folks like us are often too afraid to stand up and go, you know what? I think on the hard.
We've talked about this, but let's talk about the list. U.S. Was not today, but was and could be again. UK. Boris Johnson looks like he's the leading candidate to take over, and clearly, the U.S. Republican right was enamored with the Liz Truss economic policies and thought they were exactly what should be implemented in the United States, even though they led to a disastrous financial situation. Poland, Hungary. We could go on for the list. There's a lot of extremists, and they're running major countries.
Well, and the countries where they take power are nearly exactly at the same time as those people take power, they start the slide. And then they start the slide because they cut off the things that we know now are actually the recipe for success. We know the recipe for success for a country is to have a strong market with some clear regulations against monopoly and unfair practices, but a market that's allowed to operate more or less as it would like, with restrictions to make sure that workers' rights aren't abused and that people are treated decently and get properly paid and have some safety standards. But more or less, you let people compete in the economic sphere, and then the huge wealth that's generated by that, you then roll that back into healthcare, education, and some other government programs that generate very clear economic results that can be measured. We've got 100+ years of measuring this stuff now. What we see with those authoritarian governments, they start to put the screws to political competition, usually to the free press. The second that happens, people who are entrepreneurs start to get a bit spooked because they can see that there are fingers on the scale. If the fingers are going to be put on the scale for the media or for the political system, they know that the fingers being put on the scales for the economy and for businesses, that's not going to happen too much later. So what do those people do? They start to leave, or they stop acting as entrepreneurs and they start acting as agents of the government, and they start doing what they think the government would like them to do with their businesses. And what does that do? It takes you away from the genius of the supply and demand system that we know works, and you start to see people orienting their economies and their political systems towards those leaders. You see your best and your brightest start to leave and look for places where there is more genuine freedom. This is an inevitable consequence that we can now see played out in country after country after country. And shame on us if we don't recognize it before it hits us here. Canada already has enough problems without adding sliding down that road to the long list of structural issues we already have to deal with, from demographics to instability on the southern border to all the other challenges that we're facing in 2022. So it's going down that road, it doesn't work. Look at Brazil as a good recent example with Jaime Bolsonaro, who's adopting a lot of, I'd argue, sort of neo-fascist language and policies. It's not working. It's hurting his country. The Philippines with Duterte, fortunately now gone because of their term limits, same sorts of things. It's not a recipe for success. There are no shortcuts for wealth and prosperity and freedom. And we know what the playbook is to achieve those goals. So why wouldn't we try and figure out ways to improve a playbook that's already given us, I would argue, the best country in the history of the planet? Why wouldn't we build on that rather than trying to trash it all in an effort to be some pale imitation of American Trump fans or Hugo Chavez wannabes from Venezuela or whatever other foolish failed experiments that we're obsessed with watching, rather than building on something great that we have here? But part of that comes from, we have to start being proud of that ourselves. And on the center and the left, we've done a terrible job in this country in the last couple of decades of allowing that to be possible. We're not allowed to be proud of the country anymore. We're not supposed to be celebrating the country's history and successes. So until we can reconcile our own history and figure out how to build the good and the bad into a narrative that gives us a positive platform to jump into the future with, the people who just tell us that Canada sucks on the left and the right, they're going to be the only voices speaking up in the public sphere, in the public square. That's what we've seen the last little while.
I've had interactions recently with Indigenous people in Saskatchewan and some African Canadians in Brampton, both of which have told me that the Canadian flag is no longer something that they want to fly or they can be proud of, because it is a white supremacist symbol comparable to the Confederate flag because of what they saw going on in Ottawa. So I think there is an issue here that we need to address. Anyway, we're going to take a final break and come back with some final comments with Dominic Cardy. He's the member of the Legislative Assembly. He's from the constituency of Fredericton West Hanwell. He's the former Minister of Education. And according to his LinkedIn profile, he's a radical centrist. Sounds like an interesting term. Maybe we need more of radical centrists. Stay with us, everybody. Come back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Dominic Cardy. He is the member of the Legislative Assembly in the province of New Brunswick for the constituency of Fredericton West Hanwell. He's the former Minister of Education. He quit over disagreements with the Premier. He's recently been to the Ukraine, to the United Nations, representing Canada on educational issues. He calls himself a radical centrist. He's no longer a progressive conservative. He sits as an independent. What's the solution? This conference coming up this week, Dominic, in regards to centrist Canadians, is that one of the solutions potentially? And I got to ask you, what are some of the issues that you don't think that we're talking about in this situation today when we're overly focused on the extremes?
So first of all, I still am a member of the Progressive Conservative Party. I'm just not sitting with the caucus because the Premier was unhappy with my resignation letter, which is fine, but hopefully that'll be resolved fairly shortly. So I was still a proud Progressive Conservative in New Brunswick. Federally, I'm totally homeless. I have no interest in the tax and spend apology fest that really has defined the Trudeau government, and have absolutely no interest in a deep fear of the federal Conservative Party slide towards the populist right. So I think this week in Halifax, this Friday, we're going to be meeting with centralized Canadians for our second conference. The first was in Alberta in the summer, talking about issues facing Atlantic Canada, also some issues around healthcare and security. And I think some issues that I think we are really not properly addressing at this point. Healthcare will be high on the list. So I'm not sure exactly how old you are. I'm 52, but yeah, our entire lives, we've been talking about how, those baby boomers, there's a lot of them. They're going to retire. What's going to happen when they retire? Well, it's going to be really difficult. We're not going to have a lot of people for a lot of jobs. As far as I can tell, for the last 30 years, despite this having been headline news since the 80s, no one has done anything about this at all. And now we are faced with this crisis of a huge shortage of skilled professionals in all kinds of different fields, and healthcare being the one that's hit the most acutely right now. So we've got to start talking about how we are going to get skilled healthcare workers from around the world into Canadian hospitals as quickly as possible, which is going to mean discussions around immigration. It's going to mean discussions around professional associations. No politician wants to go to war with the doctors. But unless we can talk with our medical societies about how it is getting increasingly illegitimate to say that a doctor who has practiced in France or the UK or Belgium or Ukraine, who have got excellent healthcare systems, that they can't practice in Canada unless they go back to school and we basically treat them like an 18-year-old, this crisis is going to continue to worsen. And unless we also start to embrace new ways of delivering healthcare, that we have this bizarre, again, sort of US-inspired obsession with going on about public versus private. We have a publicly funded system delivered by the private sector in most cases. Doctors are nearly all independent business people. And we pretend that's just not the case. And we talk about how we have socialized medicine. We just don't. We have a publicly supported, subsidized system, but it's delivered by the private sector. And then somehow, though, we end up by falling into the trap of saying that, okay, well, doctors are okay to be business people, but we can't have a hip replacement clinic that's also run like a business, or an MRI clinic, or any other of the endless numbers of procedures that could easily be done outside of the overcrowded hospital setting, and run in the same way that we run the relationship with the doctors, where the government sets a fee, a price for a service that's delivered, and pays that fee. And as long as the company that's charging us doesn't make any more than that, why exactly is that the issue? Surely the issue is access to healthcare for Canadians, free on point of delivery, rather than concern about how that system is delivered. That's how most of the world runs it. But again, because I think we've had this cultural obsession with the US and not wanting to have an American-style healthcare system, which I certainly don't want to have. But in the process, we've ignored the huge ranges of creative options available for better managing a system in other countries. Another issue, security. We are, Saturday morning, I wake up and I see Hu Jintao, the former boss in China, sitting next to President Xi, is removed from the podium during the closing ceremonies for the Congress of the Communist Party in China. We are facing reports from our allies talking about an imminent invasion of Taiwan. We have a land war in Europe. We need to, as a country, increase our defense spending massively, and right now, for two reasons. First, we have a threat against our national security. We have a massive undefended border with Russia. They've got a couple of dozen of Arctic ice-capable icebreakers. We have a grand total of none, I believe, at the moment. We have no real independent armed forces. We rely totally on an increasingly unreliable United States to protect us. If we take our sovereignty seriously, we need to look at what's happening around the world and recognize that the oceans that we've relied on for a long time to protect us are not really any barrier for hypersonic missiles or the other military threats that we're facing. So security and healthcare, two big areas that we really need to, I think, change the way that we think, abandon some old ways of looking at things, keep to those core principles of publicly funded healthcare and a country that behaves decently, but recognize we've got to protect ourselves and do things differently.
Dominic Cardy, I'd vote for you. Member of the Legislative Assembly of the province of New Brunswick for the constituency of Fredericton West Hanwell. I hope your constituents elect you, whether you're independent or not, because I think you're a voice that Canada needs. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Good night.